The victor at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor, was born here at Pembroke Castle, right in the middle of the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses. He was the only son of Margaret Beaufort, the great-great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III, and that was his claim to the throne. His father, Edmund Tudor, was the son of Owen Tudor, a Welshman who had fought with Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt. All sounds fairly normal so far, but his claim to the throne was tenuous, and his mother, when he was born on the 28th of January 1457, had already been a widow for 12 weeks at the tender age of only 14. Her husband Edmund had been a Lancastrian sympathiser and captured by the Yorkists, imprisoned and executed. Henry's path to the throne was charted by a very strong-willed mother who was offered protection by her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor. It was by no means certain, when Henry took the crown, that the Wars of the Roses were indeed over. But his efforts at conciliation led first by marriage to Elizabeth of York, and the symbolism of consolidating the red rose of the House of Lancaster with the white rose of the House of York, thus creating the Tudor rose. He was finally successful in reconciling the nation, and this extremely intelligent, very wary, canny Welshman consolidated his claim to the throne. Henry sought out and put right the ills of 100 years of conflict. One of the principal sources of all the feuds was that the dukes were allowed to keep their own private armies. And with England's supremacy with the longbow as it was, that represented a considerable potential for local quarrel and bloodshed. But gunpowder and the cannon had made their way to Europe, and Henry Tudor made sure that all cannon belonged to the king. The illegality of having a private army could now be ruthlessly enforced. Henry Tudor was a master at assessing strengths and weaknesses, and by dint of what can best be described as skillful diplomacy, coupled with a certain amount of deviousness and a healthy suspicion of almost everyone, with the help of his young mother and his uncle, consolidating and adding to the existing institutions of government, including Parliament, as well as creating a sound relationship with the nations of Europe, he prepared for his son and heir to inherit a kingdom in a very healthy state. Of the children his wife bore him, 2 sons lived beyond infancy, the older Arthur and the younger Henry. And as was the diplomatic custom of the time, friendly relations between England and Spain were consolidated when it was agreed that Arthur should marry the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. The wedding took place at Winchester Cathedral in the autumn of 1501, when Arthur and Catherine were both 15 years old. Arthur's younger brother Henry was then 10. After the wedding, the new Prince and Princess of Wales moved to Ludlow Castle. Like Henry I, Henry VII had put in place everything a king could reasonably be expected to do to prepare the succession of his son and heir. But as the Scotsman Rabbie Burns shrewdly observed, the best laid plans of mice and men gang aft agley. Henry I had lost his only son William in the White Ship disaster. Not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, history was about to cruelly repeat itself. Both Arthur and Catherine caught a chill, and within 5 months, Arthur was dead, succumbing to a bout of influenza. Catherine was now a widow, at the age of only 15, and the king's spare heir, also Henry, became the heir to the English throne. With Europe becoming increasingly unstable, Catherine stayed in England. and their two parents agreed that Henry and Catherine should be married when Henry came of age. At this stage, Henry was not keen on the idea, but Catherine was made Spanish ambassador to England, in the hope that the diplomatic function of creating friendly relations between Spain and England, which their parents had both intended, would eventually be fulfilled. Arthur's mother, the Queen Elizabeth of York, died the following year, when Henry himself was only 11 years old. But his father, Henry Tudor, although heartbroken at the death of his eldest son and heir, and his wife only a year later, continued for another 7 years to build a strong foundation for his second son to inherit. And when Henry finally became king in 1509, he changed his mind about marrying Catherine, and a special dispensation was applied for to the Pope to enable Henry to marry his dead brother's widow. So Henry, at the start of his reign, had everything in his favour, including a bright, young, happy, healthy queen on his arm, who would no doubt bring him lots of sons to ensure a safe and secure future for the crown. A confidence grew in England which had not been known ever before. The nation was at peace. Universities were expanding, and the safe spaces which were a prerequisite for the existence of the mental freedoms to explore all sorts of new ideas were filled with eager, inquiring minds. The philosophy of King Alfred the Great, to have a nation peopled by men of war to defend what had been built, men of work to do what was necessary to maintain it, and men of prayer to plan for the future, was becoming a reality because of the strength of the navy to prevent invasion, the Parliament to give a voice to the hopes and fears of every citizen, and the universities to learn, understand, and put into practice the Christian principles that were the basis of the Constitution. The English translation of the Bible had opened people's eyes and minds to the corruption within the Roman Church. Outside the normal world of ecclesiastical guidance, there were other areas of study, and a better access to biblical scripture enabled new studies and new interpretations of what had been taught and expected by the Roman Catholic Church to be taken as gospel. One such brilliant, inquiring mind was that of young Thomas More, a very traditional Roman Catholic Christian of the time, who wrote a book called Utopia, a discussion about what would make the perfect state, with remarkably modern ideas: free hospitals, communal living, a maximum of 6 hours a day of compulsory work, no unemployment. Women would be able to work at the same jobs as men. Everyone would be required to have a skill which would contribute to the economy. Houses would be made of stone, not wood, for reasons both of health and to minimize the risk of the destruction by fire of entire communities, a not uncommon occurrence in the closely packed towns and cities of those days. But far from encouraging this kind of new inquiry, the Roman Catholic Church taught that it was heresy and would burn at the stake anyone exploring ideas which were in direct conflict with the Church's teachings. In 1478, a few years before the Battle of Bosworth, Pope Sixtus IV instituted what became known as the Spanish Inquisition, originally to seek out and punish by death those Jews who had converted to Christianity, claiming the conversion to be on grounds of expediency rather than sincere conviction. Evidence of the claim would not be required by the court, because it would be better for the immortal soul, if the body suffered an agonizing and painful death in this life, in order to fit it better for the next. Anyone who contradicted official Roman Catholic doctrine over the next century or so would suffer the same fate. In 1513, the Florentine philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli wrote a treatise which served as a handbook on how to use fear and dependency as political weapons to rule. It became the foundation of political practice throughout mainland Europe. The simple biblical message of the original Celtic Church was being replaced by a set of doctrinaire dogma originating from the popes in Rome, by which the ordinary people of Europe within the Holy Roman Empire could be kept under control. Meanwhile, in Britain, whilst still wishing to preserve a relationship with their Creator, a growing number of people felt increasingly sceptical, if not indeed openly contemptuous, of the teachings of the Roman Church. When it reached that point in the service where the local priest mounted the pulpit to give his sermon, it became not uncommon for a significant number of the congregation to leave the church with much ribaldry and go across the village green to the local inn for a drink and a chat, as you do, about current affairs, even though for many centuries it had been suggested that the earth was in fact round. Most people believed that the earth was flat and the centre of the universe. In 1514, the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus put forward the idea that the earth went round the sun, not the other way round. An absurd notion for the time, but one which set people thinking. Inquisitive minds were searching for alternative answers to the ones they were getting from the church, and the universities were the perfect place to conduct such inquiries. Others, searching for more practical adventures, decided to explore the oceans. Because of the absence of navigational equipment and charts, ships would only sail close enough to the shore to avoid getting lost. When Bartholomew Diaz rounded the southernmost tip of Africa in 1488, he paved the way to the very lucrative sea route for the spice trade, a magnificent feat of skill and courage, given the kinds of charts of the known world that they had to work with in those days. And when Vasco da Gama finally reached India 10 years later, the spice trade was well and truly opened up. 6 years earlier, in 1492, Christopher Columbus had managed to finance an expedition to sail across the Atlantic Ocean westwards, because he believed that the world was round and he would be able to get to the Spice Islands more quickly by sailing westwards, bearing in mind that most of the common sailors of those days still believed that the earth was flat, and if they sailed far enough they would sail over the edge. It was a very brave and courageous voyage to undertake, but Columbus finally set sail in 1492 in the Nina, Pinta and Santa Maria, and as everybody now knows, he found a whole new continent was blocking his way, as is shown by this 1502 map of a very much enlarged world. It would be left to the explorer Amerigo Vespucci to establish unequivocally that it was a new continent and give it his name. And finally, the Catholic Church was thrown into complete turmoil when Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator and sailor, sailed round the world to the west in 1519, proving that the earth was round. That's 10 years after Henry VIII came to the English throne, and it's worth noting as a final point about all of these explorers from Spain and Portugal, that the principal instigator of all of this intrepid exploration, the Prince of Portugal, Henry the Navigator, was a direct descendant of John of Gaunt, from whose line the Tudor kings of England took their claim to the throne. In 1509, then, The world was ideologically and geographically an exciting and rapidly expanding place in which to live. But the contrasting responses to this new learning of mainland Europe and Great Britain would set in motion conflicting styles of government which would produce bitter rivalries and bloodshed for many centuries. Britain was soon to become the island race fighting for its very existence, which it has remained ever since.